Very much, Ian. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a treat to spend time with Scott Carson, is actually the author of this book, but we know him as Michael Koryta, so there's absolutely no point in my pretending. Besides, I'll never remember to call him Scott, and then I'll look like an idiot. But anyway, he's back in Bloomington, Indiana, and we are going to talk about Departure 37. Now, our signed copies are somewhere between Michael and us, but we only have like a dozen left. So if you're interested in one, grab one while they're en route before he takes off for like Maine and we can't reach him anymore. Right. So Michael, what I really love about, well, there are many things I love about this book, but what sort of makes me it sort of amuses me. This is historical fiction for you that required a lot of research. I'm in my middle 20s by now. I'm a mom, I'm out of college, I'm working in the whole bit, and I think, how is it that my life has turned into historical fiction?
Well, I wouldn't have actually known that about you. I wouldn't have been able to crunch the numbers because you're ageless. Um, but I'm curious then. I have to open with a question to you. Do you feel like I did it justice? Did I get the
Yes, I do. And in
parallel?
fact, I gave this to my husband to read. He's 5 years younger than I am, but he's still, um, how old was he in 1965? What is that the year we are in, roughly?
62 was,
62. Okay,
yes,
so
good
he
one.
is 17. So he has enough memory, and he certainly has a memory of how much angst the war in Vietnam was causing, particularly young men. I'm a Vietnam War widow, so it was a very difficult thing for me. Both of us felt that you really captured the emotion and the kind of I don't know that I call it paranoia, but there was this kind of constant sense of dread.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
we were still close enough to Hiroshima to have people that, I mean, today they're only, I think I saw the other day, there are like three Japanese people still alive that survived Hiroshima. But it was a lot closer in 1965, 62. And so I think the horrors of that were emotional more than intellectual. Today, I think they're more intellectual because nobody's really got that much experience with it. And, all the carrying on from Putin and the whole bit. I mean, one of my questions was back when that war started, how do we know he even has nuclear weapons that you know, are deployable? I mean, they're so old. I mean, how much of that was a bluff? But then again, who wanted to really find out?
Exactly. And I think I'm so glad you put your finger right on the question or the point of it's become intellectual when once it was emotional and it was deeply felt. And what I'm trying to do with the novel um, is bridge the two eras, take that 1962 moment and bounce it off. I guess we're not quite there yet. It's October 2025 when my little imaginary DARPA project brings the past into the present. But I wanted to make us feel the thing that we are forgetting and intellectualizing. And I think there's such great peril in um, forgetting how deeply affected the world was by the existence of the atomic bomb and how quickly people like Oppenheimer began, a lot of the people who were at Trinity, the Trinity test, immediately felt this sense of, uh-oh, regret. And that was before it was dropped on a civilian population. So regardless of what their thoughts were as terms of military strategy are concerned, they knew that the world would never be the same after they created this. And for maybe 20 years, you have that shadow, that paranoia, that dread looming really large in the American culture. And then it becomes intellectualized. And we get to the 80s and the Berlin Wall falls. And even though the weapons are still out there, and even though we continue to race for more of them, and they're going to be smaller and more lethal, I don't think people are really feeling the risk. One of the books I read in research for this was called It's one of the most terrifying reads I've ever encountered, and it's nonfiction. It's by Annie Jacobson, Nuclear War, a Scenario. And she breaks down the various responses. It is in minutes, like 7 minutes, that a president would have to respond. And when I dug into what October of 1962 really looked like, the American mythology was quick into action there. And we had this version of it where you have the Kennedys, John, obviously, but also Bobby, and you have McNamara and Kissinger, and you have these very sober intellectual men who go into a room and they make a sober, careful, pragmatic decision and they save the world, which is not entirely a false narrative. There is some truth to that. John Kennedy, in particular, makes some good calls, but a lot of it is also dumb luck. And that story doesn't account for the thing we didn't know until decades later, which was the Soviet submarine
Right.
armed with nuclear weapons that we depth charged to the surface off the coast of Florida. And there is debate on that sub about whether a hot war has already started and whether they should launch. And here we have two guys, one in particular, who might have saved the world quite literally, arguing in the most pragmatic terms that if there was an atomic exchange on the surface, the American Navy wouldn't care about this one sub enough to depth charge it and bring it up. And so they kind of win a rational argument. And the sub comes up, they have an exchange by radio with the US Navy, and they go away from the blockade in Cuba. And it is decades before the Americans really understand how close they came, how close we all came.
Well, in the history of the world, there's uh, a whole cycle about war, and it usually takes at least one full generation to separate from a war before re-engaging,
Mhm.
because there's that whole period of, forgetfulness, and then um, you have a whole new group of people who don't understand the horror because they didn't live through it
Right.
and, are prepared to do it again. When we were in Japan, I don't remember which trip, and we're about to go again. I've been to Hiroshima and I've never wanted to go to the memorial in the middle of it. There's some really lovely stuff near Hiroshima. So while it is a tourist stop, and most people go there. I have instead chosen to go to the shrine at um, Miyama or whatever it is. But when we were in Nagasaki, we did have a guide that talked to us about the difference between Hiroshima and Nagasaki in terms of what happened when the bombs were dropped. And it was geology. Hiroshima was flat. And
Mhm.
so when the bomb came down, there was nothing, to really channel it, disperse it, whatever. Nagasaki was not physically, and we're not talking about radiation, but the physical stuff was not much destroyed because it's like hills and valleys and
Yeah,
the whole bit.
mountainous
And so
terrain.
the
Yeah.
yep, the blast stuff was all dispersed. So Hiroshima was basically destroyed, but Nagasaki, most of the old buildings and everything, they survived. That doesn't have anything to do with the effect of the radiation on the population. But I mean, we didn't even know that, when
Right.
and there's a new book just out called The Ghosts of Hiroshima, which in theory James Cameron is going to make into a movie. And the thesis of that was that there was enough uranium delivered from Oak Ridge to have created a third bomb. And the third bomb went off. I mean, went off to Japan, didn't mean exploded.
Yes.
And it fell into the hands of the Japanese, who then had to make a decision about whether to retaliate using this third
Mhm.
bomb or whether they should make a more pragmatic decision and, let it go, which is sort of what you've been talking about. So I think we're just so far removed from it now. But the other thing I worry about, and this is another element in your book, which my husband really responded to, which is AI, which comes up a lot in book discussions. We had a big discussion yesterday at Bookstore Romance Day, when people keep asking authors if they're using it, are they going to let it write their books, and how do they feel about the piracy? And all the rest of it. But I think young people are living in a virtual world to the degree that they may not really even understand physical world consequences at this point.
That's one of the reasons I really wanted to write the book. I mean, obviously, goal number one is tell an entertaining story, right? But
Right.
I do think um, the point that I'm trying to make here is the intersection between the rhetoric used around the nuclear race in the 50s and 60s and AI just in the last 3 years, while I've been writing this, there is so much overlap in the way it is described, first of all, as a race, which one of the characters in the book says the problem with a race is that it requires an end. And how do you really win that thing? The rules with AI, and it doesn't frighten me as much as a writer as it does as a human. The rules of AI from the most brilliant minds involved with creating it tended to be that this stuff would be air gapped, which means it would not be connected to the live internet. That was rule number one. And then it would also never be allowed to code for itself. And those things went right out the window. And it's using the exact same rhetoric that was used in the 50s and 60s to explain why we needed a hydrogen bomb, because the ones we dropped on Japan weren't deadly enough, and why we needed more of them, why they needed to be smaller, different payloads, all of these things. In between, you have a lot of contractors getting incredibly wealthy, and their shareholders are doing very, very well. And that is a perfect mirror, I think, of the AI moment here, where we're saying we must win the race or China will. And you kind of prop up this idea of a villain without ever explaining necessarily the scenario. There are people getting fabulously wealthy in between, and there is this shadow of angst and dread that seeps into the popular culture. And you saw that with the Cold War. I mean, paranoia fiction really took off. Jack Finney always argued that The Body Snatchers, which became Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the film was not political. Plenty of people read it as a political novel, though. And so I really wanted to latch on to that intersection and try to hold the mirror up to that moment, and also to get that cross generational argument going. So I have Charlie Goodwin, who's a 16-year-old girl off the coast of Maine who feels she's a Brooklyn kid. She feels exiled to nowhere in this abandoned, decommissioned naval airfield, where eventually one of the projects that DARPA played around with in the height of the Cold War, right ahead of the Cuban Missile Crisis, will come sailing back. And I loved her character because she was able to give me a voice at the moment. And she is very world weary and cynical in the way that only a 16-year-old can be. And then she's contrasted with Abe Zimmer, who's this retired pilot who is the conspiracy theorist, right? He believes it all. He's the guy who would watch an episode of the X Files and just nod his head and be like, "Yep, no questions asked. That absolutely passes his documentary test." So I loved giving him one thing to be right about, and then giving her plenty to be right about. But to have that moment of contrast and emotional conflict between the generations seemed very valuable to me. It was a way to, within a story that hopefully is a lot of fun, also create a bigger dialogue that I think we need to be having, and take some of the intellectualizing of it and bring it home and make people feel it in a different way.
You're right. Talking about it as a race creates some dynamic, but the thing I remember most clearly, because I was a child all during the Cold War and, or I was in school and all, is basically you were made to be afraid of being a victim. You
Mm-hmm.
didn't, you had no power. These were all things that were going to happen beyond your control, your parents' control, whatever it might be. And so the fear came from being a victim. And we're seeing that in the political, I mean, all around us. Today even unbelievable stuff is happening that you and I brought up, couldn't imagine would actually be happening in our lifetimes, if
Mhm.
ever. So we're already back in a um, them versus us, power versus victim, where we don't seem to have any control over it. And who knows where these people are going to take us? I
And I
mean,
think that's one of the most primal fears that people respond to. It's the sense of being alone and not having control.
right.
And that's one of the reasons that I sort of paired this with a coming of age narrative.
Yeah.
I think there's that moment, and I dealt with this in Lost Man's Lane, the book just ahead of this. The moment when you realize the adults don't have all of the answers
Right.
is deeply unsettling. Most of us, when we're 16, 17 years old, we feel so wise. We think we're smarter than our parents, and we just want the world to respect us as such. But then when the crap hits the fan, when things really get real, we want our mothers, we want our fathers, we want someone to turn to. And I think the adult version of that is you want to believe that there are grown-ups in the room of government who are going to be the actors. And when you realize that they don't really have the control that you hoped, that's another deeply unsettling moment. And I mean, every generation has those. I feel like we're having more of those moments come at us faster uh,
Mhm.
than certainly in my lifetime. There was a moment of innocence growing up, going to high school in the 90s. I graduated in 2001. 9/11 was the moment when we realized, wait a second, the adults in the room might not have this thing under control. And that was a bookend to Columbine, which was also, we watched this tragedy play out, and everyone from each party comes along and says, never again. This will never happen again. And now I look at it in 2025,
Yeah.
and we have come culturally to just accept this. There will be another school shooting. We don't know when or where, but it will happen. We accept it. We'll go through the rhetoric of thoughts and prayers, and we'll move on. And The Onion will run that unbelievable headline that they just have been cranking out now for years. No way to stop this, says only nation where this happens on a regular basis. I love that. It's so
Well,
powerful.
it is, but of course, it also means that it runs right up against the fact that we are not willing to give up guns. And this last election was a single issue election for a huge number of people. And many of them, it was all about guns. They didn't want to. So Americans have never really reconciled the degree of freedom they want with the degree of safety that's desirable. And that's why we just kind of accept it. Other countries, are much tighter about weapon control and all. But also, I think we used to think that people didn't act against their self-interest. I mean, we had the kamikaze pilots in World War II, and that was sort of hard to understand.
Mhm.
But, for most people, the idea that guys would climb into an airplane and deliberately fly it into something, thus causing their own destruction, was pretty hard to imagine. And yet, we have seen more pilot suicides and so forth, subsequently. So I don't know. It's people don't behave the way I thought they did when I was young. And I also think it's terrifying when you recognize at some point in your growing up that you're going to be the adult in the room, that role is going to transfer to you. And
Absolutely.
yep, and so you're right. With 16, we think we know everything. And but at some point, maybe as we're aging, we recognize how little we really know.
Well, there's a reason I keep coming back in the character of Marty Hazelton in the book. He's obsessed with that Einstein quote, which I can see over my desk right here. It hangs above my desk. Have holy curiosity. And I love that because um, Einstein is viewed as the man who provided the answers, right? But his worldview was it was more important to be asking the questions. And that is something that I wanted to tap into with this book. It's the price of not asking the questions that can really lead us into a perilous place. And I think, we were talking about Oppenheimer earlier, the immediate regret. Some people felt, while others immediately had this instinct that not only did we need to build more of these bombs, uh, but we needed to make them better, deadlier, increase the arsenal. So you said humans don't behave the way we think they do. I would argue that technology is moving at a speed that we don't really appreciate, and human nature is crawling behind it. And the atomic age is an example of that. AI is another example of that. But when you go back and think about just 1 century, commercial aviation alone seemed bewildering. That was the stuff of science fiction. Um, then you get to the atomic bomb. Now we get to the iPhone in everyone's pocket. And this is all, when you really pause and get a little distance, think how fast that all came along. It's staggering. And human nature is still pretty much where it was. You,
Yep.
you have your tribal infighting, you have your desire for power and leverage, you have your fundamental greed, you have the desire to protect your own, and there is an overriding, you touched on this earlier, an overriding fear of the other and of being a victim. And there is an assumption that the other, whoever they are, would make you a victim, which is a very fascinating bit of human nature, I think. And
Yeah.
it
Well,
drives a lot of
fear
great.
mongering is, has been a long established way to try to control people, is to make them fearful, have them blame the other, whether it's the War of the Worlds or, Holocaust or whatever. It's always easier to blame the not you. Um, rather than seeing yourself as a victim. I mean, I find it fascinating how many people I have seen in the news and so forth who are blaming, they were sold this bill of goods. They are blaming immigrants for the fact that there are not enough high-paying jobs and
Mhm.
not enough housing, where in point of fact, it's really AI that's going to take away their jobs and not having people able and willing to work um, without, I don't even know. Anyway, it's going to affect the food supply. It's going to affect all sorts of things. And so I find it fascinating that people can be brought to believe that they feel like victims. And so it's easier to blame somebody else than to try to figure out a strategy to overcome it. Maybe I've never felt hopeless. I don't really understand how that would be. Maybe you don't either. But it clearly is
No,
true
I think
that people do.
accountability seems to be something that is very challenging for humans in general. And
Mhm.
the idea of admitting your own mistakes seems particularly challenging. That's uh, Hazelton in the book. He's sort of my Oppenheimer figure.
Right.
It's hard to talk about this without giving a big spoiler, but I'll just say he is, in some ways, the most honest man and the most deceitful man
Yeah.
in the story. And he wants to be able, he desperately believes that he can put it all back together, that if he has enough control, he can make it work. It's a puzzle, it's math. He can balance it out in the end. And it's the presence of mystery, the idea of you're eventually going to have to enter an unknown, right? That is the one thing we are promised here. We are headed toward a mystery. That is the thing that breaks him um, in the end. And I can't, as I said, I'll toy with a huge spoiler. But I very much enjoyed writing his character because of that mindset, because of that desire for control. And also, he sort of cloaks himself in science and says, at the end of the day, we're all just atoms in it. We're stardust, we're these little pieces of dead stars. So I don't need to worry too much about my actions and how they affect other people. And that is the narrative that he wraps himself around. And then Marilyn Metzger walks into his life, and we don't know if she's a spy initially or for whom, but she says she's a widow of one of the pilots from Flight 19, which was this group. Do you remember Flight 19, the mythology around it? Okay, so it perpetuated a lot of the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle.
Right.
This torpedo squadron flies out of Fort Lauderdale on a clear day, and they head in the wrong direction, even though they should have all been able to determine which direction west was. Their radio transcripts were very mysterious, and I mean, they were just catnip for conspiracy theorists, and they all vanish. Spielberg touches on the planes a little bit in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, too. One of the rescue planes sent to find them then blows up, but we don't really have a clear answer on Flight 19. It appears that the most reliable answer is a fascinating little study in human nature where people follow the leader even and past the point of no return for themselves. But we don't know. We're left with the mystery. And so I loved Marilyn as a character because she has latched on to a conspiracy in which she can blame Hazleton and the people who were working with him as the ultimate source of her husband's death. And if he will just say that her theory is right, in some way she will come to peace with the loss. And the reality is she can't. The grief is still there. The grief is still the same. The mystery remains. So I really enjoyed the way her character pushed up against his worldview.
So we've actually talked about, and there's one more thing that we could come back to, but we haven't really sort of sketched out the story. So we are when this book opens, we are where?
So the book opens, I get present day, we're not quite there yet. It's October 2025, and 500 pilots, commercial pilots around the world, around the country, are getting calls in the middle of the night from their mothers. And their mothers are saying, you know me, I'm not superstitious. I've never asked you not to fly, but I had a premonition, and you can't fly tomorrow. Just promise me you won't. And they feel as if they're talking to their actual mothers. This is in the age, I was writing this in the age when the idea of the deep fake was pretty new. And now we've all heard the term and we're living with it. Um, there's a video component that's very plausible. I was just working with audio. So you have roughly 500 pilots call in sick, and then we watch that ripple out and clear the skies.
So you get a complete ground stop, right?
Yep, we have a complete ground stop.
Which we actually know right now, you could just hack into United software because it just
Yes,
happened yesterday.
we've
And,
had them before.
right.
The last one, I mean, the last one that most of America remembers was 9/11.
Yeah.
Although there was one brief one after that due to a software glitch. But it's a fundamentally disturbing thing, to really shut down the American airspace. And I had that idea, but I didn't yet have the idea of what. I became very interested in the question, why would someone want to do that? And the why in this book, which is not a spoiler because it's on the dust jacket, is that we're about to have a plane from 1962 reappear off the coast of Maine. And that's where 16-year-old Charlie is. She's living her life in exile. Her mother just died. She's a Brooklyn kid who is living at this decommissioned naval airfield where she's making TikTok videos, sort of mocking a conspiracy theorist who believes he saw something impossible happen when he was a kid in this moment in 1962 off the coast of Maine.
Right. Okay. So there's your past and your present coming together. Um, I found it fascinating. I mean, I actually made this our historical fiction pick for August because I thought you did such a terrific job with the 1960s. And I'm depressed to realize that the 1960s, if you sort of draw a line at 50 years for historical fiction, the lines moved up in the 36 years I've had the bookstore, it keeps
Yes.
moving up. So the 1960s, I think, are there. But I remember watching, and maybe you did, the last two episodes of Foyle's War, or maybe it was the last three, but one of them takes place in Los Alamos. And, and a consequence of even watching the Trinity test is a big part of it. But what that brought out, and which I have thought about a lot, is that thing that has allowed us to evolve from whatever collection of cells we were to the present, which is our curiosity and our superior brain power, intellectual, whatever you want to call it, means that we can't not pursue
Right.
something new. And that's what happened. That was sort of the summation of why did we actually build the bomb? I mean, why did we do it? And when they tested it, they knew that maybe they shouldn't have done it, but the curiosity, there was a big debate. Joe Cannon wrote about that really well in Los Alamos, if you remember that, won an Edgar for it, whether they should even test it because nobody knew what the consequences of actually but no one could resist it. They
No
had
one could
worked on it,
resist the,
and they were gonna, I mean, it was like giving a kid a drone and saying you can't fly it, right? Not gonna happen. And that's AI is the same thing. I mean, there it is, and it's impossible for some people to resist seeing what it will do, regardless of where it will go, even though it
absolutely.
may turn out to be completely destructive, you know?
It could invent I mean, one of the most fascinating stories with AI in the last year, when they test their ability to shut it down and it will code a copy of itself and try to hide itself. But then those engineers, I forget if it was OpenAI or DeepMind, I don't remember which platform, but they had given it access to an engineer's emails, his personal emails. And then he came on, even though they were fake because this was a security test. Uh, they tell the system, the AI, that it is about to be replaced. It's now obsolete and it needs to shut itself down. And its response is to blackmail the engineer with knowledge of, even though it was a fictional affair, it had read through his emails and thought that it had knowledge that he was having an affair. And it blackmailed him rather than just say, yes, I'm your little bot servant and I'm um, not sentient. So why would I want to exist? It very much wanted to continue to exist. And it went to some pretty drastic lengths to do that. So even knowing that, we keep pushing forward with these systems, knowing that they could have really disastrous consequences. They could do some amazing things too. The potential in the medical world is just,
Yeah,
obviously could be amazing. I feel like we're directing them in the wrong way, and I feel like we're taking the guardrails off in the wrong way. But that seems to be very in keeping with the era. I mean, that's why I wanted to bridge the two. I think the
sure.
atomic moment and the AI moment feels very similar, not just in rhetoric, but in approach. And the the idea of the deep fake, that call in the night that you would want to answer. Your better angel would say, okay, I need to answer this and I need to trust it. We're injecting a fundamental level of distrust even into that.
Mhm.
The more outlandish the scenario, if you heard your husband's voice on the other end of the line, there is now this part of you that kind of whispers, is that really him? And that fresh injection of paranoia is fascinating to me. As a writer, as long as we writers continue to exist, that's really exciting stuff to work with.
Don't you think part of the problem is that somehow we still feel that we can control things? I mean, even though they did the Trinity test, they still felt somehow they were in charge.
Oh,
And
we went right back to testing bigger and better. I mean, after not just after Trinity, after dropping the bombs on Japan, we're testing them in the Pacific. So Ivy Mike, which makes this book, I mean, we incinerated an island. We blew it off the map. And we had no idea what would happen with that either. And yet we tried it. We create a new radiation belt in space, and we blow the Telstar satellite, which we had just put up there, right out of commission. And it's extraordinary to think at this point, you can't even say we don't know what will happen because we've seen it. We've had a decade to sit with this, and yet we wanted to test the newer, bigger, deadlier version of it. And there was really very little hesitation. I can't think of the actor's name, but there was a voiceover to that from like a B movie Western actor who is, we're very proud of what we're about to do here as we wipe this island off the map. And then we thought we understood how far the radiation cloud would go. We were wrong about that, didn't account for the winds, and end up poisoning 13 fishermen on a boat off the coast of Japan again. So it's an extraordinary thing that we feel we can't resist, as you said, that compulsion to, if we have the thing, we must test it.
But Michael, I think some of this is just evolution. I mean, I don't know if you've read some of the studies, but I'm trying to remember, maybe it was the Times or anyway, recently there was a serious study about why the Neanderthals did not continue to thrive and gave way to the Cro-Magnon, even though there was interbreeding and all of us have a little Neanderthal or something, but how come they faded away? And much of it has to do with brain activity. And that, I mean, part of it, I love this, part of it was sunscreen. I just thought that was fascinating that,
Yes.
the guys that dressed in fur and whatever it is, had less radiation and therefore were evolutionary more, whatever it is. But basically, what it did is it comes back to brain power. So that thing that has brought us to who we are today, which is this constant, maximizing brain power, curiosity, regardless of the consequences and all, is probably the thing that's gonna author our destruction, unless, of course, another comet or something crashes, I mean, there's always that possibility that the universe will decide it all for us, or climate change is going. People seem so surprised by climate change, and I want to say to them, why do you think there's oil in Siberia? How is it the North Slope of Alaska is a petroleum field if at one point it wasn't tropical? I mean, it doesn't take any rocket science to know that petroleum is, a product of, carbon,
A different environment at one point in
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
and I mean, and so we're in, a climate fluctuation. It may be that the Ring of Fire is gonna, there's all kinds of volcanic rumbling and all the rest of it. So, we're not the only life form that has flourished and then has been destroyed by, the planet, the universe, whatever it is. What I think makes us interesting is that we may just destroy ourselves without outside help.
Without outside help,
Yeah,
and in the pursuit of, as you said, intellectual curiosity.
which was our strength, but it may ultimately prove
So we
to be
exactly
that thing,
we might just lean on that one great evolutionary advantage
right?
so hard that we are going to be the authors of our own destruction.
Yep,
Or, as the book posits,
yep.
there's some group at DARPA who is working on an old project that will blink out of the past and save us all.
Well, I remember watching Space Odyssey 2001, there was Hal.
There was
Um,
Al.
Yep. A
Our
sort of
friend or our
premonition.
warning.
Kind of a premonition of all of this. And and you're absolutely right that the rate of change has accelerated to the point where it's almost impossible to keep up. And here's a scary thought. I mean, I really thought about this when I went to Thriller Fest. I fly into Newark because it's from Phoenix. It's smarter not to fly over Manhattan to JFK, right?
Yep.
So I had a car picking me up at the Hilton to go back to Newark to go home. And I was at the Morgan Library, 36th Street, like what, 16 blocks or something from the Hilton, looking at the Jane Austen exhibit. And as I was walking back to meet the car, my United app sent me a note and it said, "You should have left for the airport by now." I'm serious
Yes.
because in
Yes.
order to use the app, you had to
You
allow it
have to
to do the
share your location.
location thing. And it actually said to me, I mean, I couldn't believe it. I looked at my phone, "You should have left for the airport by now." And I thought, oh my God. And I travel a lot. I don't think it's possible to really travel today if you don't have a phone.
No.
Everything, but the fact that my airline software is actually tracking me and
Mhm.
suggesting to me that I might miss my flight if I don't get a move on was so bizarre. I mean, talk about a mama state, or a nanny state. If,
Yes.
if your airline app is now your
Your
nanny,
airline app is now nudging you along.
where are we
And
going?
Delta, meanwhile, is nervously walking back their cheerful shareholder call where they bragged about their AI enhanced pricing, which is
Yes,
all about finding the limit of what you, the individual, will
that's
pay
right.
and setting the price to that point.
I love that they call it dynamic pricing.
Dynamic, yes, isn't
I
that?
mean, that's such bullshit. It is
It's
just,
not gouging, it's dynamic.
I know. So my counter to the whole thing is that, and I'm fortunate that I can do this, and it sounds really obnoxious, but I have a paralyzed leg, and I'm not allowed to sit up for any long period of time, and so I fly business class, and none of that comes up. If you're willing to pay whatever outrageous price they
It's
are
less
asking,
dynamic
you're
already.
done. They don't ask you for, you
That's
know,
called static extortion. It's very different. Yes.
Right. But I mean, in a way, it takes you out of
Mhm.
all of that because I think, that there's a huge like gaming element in trying to fly anything but business class. It's just ridiculous.
Absolutely.
I mean, everyone on the plane has like some different story and different price level if you're in the rear cabin. And I understand that's where almost all of the turbulence from passengers come. I mean, there's hardly ever somebody in business class who like totally loses it, right? Because
It's
I mean, their whole decision about it was a different thing, but very few of us can actually do that. And I feel fortunate, but that didn't save me from United.
it didn't save you from United, who was
The fact
watching
that
you
I was
all the
actually,
while. Yes,
yeah, the fact that I was
listening to you
actually
them.
to
It
pay
is
my
interesting
way
too
there.
how willing we are to um, outsource so much of our daily life to tech uh,
Yep. Well, think
without
about
really
it.
questioning it. And then we're surprised when bad things happen as a result of that. Um, I, this is one of the great things about reading. It reclaims a little bit of your most precious resource, which is your attention. You
Yep.
are, at the end of the day, if you want to really distill this, you are your attention. That is all that you are. It's what are you commanding, pointing your consciousness toward at that moment in time. Um, and to lock into a book is to reclaim that for a moment. One person, the author, is trying to command your attention and take it from you, which is a little bit more reassuring than the phone, where you're being bludgeoned with the notifications from so many sources and so many different motivations. And we also know that reading is good for our brains, our our emotional and intellectual brains. So keep
That's
selling
also
these
where
things.
it's also where superagers have the advantage. There was I think it was the Journal published a report the other day where they interviewed I wrote actually, I'll quote, to our customers today in our mailing list, which is now 31,000 people, which I find amazing. But anyway, and I said to them, On a positive note, because I've been talking about something else, recent studies you can believe have shown that superagers are, as a rule, highly socialized, meaning they not only dine and party out, but they attend community fostering events and discussions such as we host at the Pen. Coming to them is good for your health. You can see that it has been good for mine. It's also the case that reading is good for your mental, emotional, and physical health, and then I went on about, play Wordle or something. But the fact that actually exercising your brain
Yeah.
is a defense mechanism against losing it. They
Yes.
worry about losing muscle mass when you get old, but you should also think about losing brain power, and the way to keep it is to engage. And as you say, you're an author is you're a portal to something. I mean, you're in a mind meld with the book, with the story. And
Absolutely.
and if you hello, are you my mind meld? Dog has been on my lap the whole time here. There's nothing more strengthening to your, I think, emotional well-being and intelligence is to be able to root yourself in that kind of an experience and conversation
Hmm.
and not let, people trying to sell you stuff influence you, whatever. I mean, I'm actually amazed at how naive people are about the book world. They actually think, that recommended reading is not paid advertising.
Right.
And did you see the thing? It's the other thing I quoted because Axios, which came to my attention in some way, pointed out that the Library of Congress, my employer, once upon a time, published an online constitution missing its clauses on unlawful detention and foreign bribes, allegedly due to a coding error. I went on to say that I can't give you the link to open it as it's been taken down now after being called out, but anyone naive enough to believe that this was a coding error should be reading sharper crime fiction. I mean,
Yes.
so what do you do with people who will stumble on that and think that that's the real deal? I mean, how many people they talk about their constitutional rights all the time, but the number of people who've actually even read the Constitution and understand it is diminishing practically, and especially if you can't even get an authentic version of it.
Yeah,
That's like
absolutely.
that's like Bible studies when they show you the translation errors over the centuries in the Bible explain why, a rich man can't pass through the eye of a needle when the actual word was rope. It was written as the
Details,
rope can't do it.
translations,
Yeah.
interpretation.
So there's all kinds of, accidental and purposeful degrading of so you have to really trust the author to have created a story and based it on things the author believes in. If it's something that required research, fine. If it's just pure fiction, doesn't make any difference. But if you don't have that experience, if you're spending all your time on apps,
Mhm.
letting it do its thinking for you, you are giving up that thing that we were talking about, that thing that has allowed us to evolve and thrive. So, I think these are really important topics, Michael. I truly do.
Great.
And besides that, it's a really fun book. I mean, Michael's a wonderful writer, and he really has always been great at creating a narrative that just carries you along. And my husband and I are completely different readers, and I was fascinated. I handed it over to him, and he enjoyed this just as much as I did, but for very different reasons. And he did want me to ask you, he said, why didn't you explain what the light in the eyes? He was not able to determine what was the point of that.
Yes, well, I'm going to again flirt with a spoiler here. Um, I thought it was very important to Marty's character that we hold that idea of some mystery, something that is not answered yet by the inquiring mind. But also, it's the idea that there will be a consequence for this little test. To me, that was more symbolic of the unseen, unintended consequence of um, the bomb is the radiation that drifted out and affected a bunch of people who we didn't think it was going to touch. and we didn't understand how it was going to affect them. And there might be another book where I come back to those characters with those eyes. So I'm not sure on that yet, but if I do circle back to a sequel on this one, I have some ideas of exactly where I'm going to take that. So
So
we'll
that's
open with beware of a character with particularly bright blue eyes.
absolutely true. So this is Michael writing Scott Carson that started out to be sort of Ghosts in Indiana and has clearly evolved into a wonderful series of books. What about your standard crime fiction, which is also brilliant, but seems to be much more rooted in actual like everyday crime? What's going on there?
Yeah, so Michael Koryta will be back next year with it's a gangster novel based loosely around real characters. There is a group from Indiana that followed on the heels of Dillinger, the Al Brady gang, and they
Right.
reached public enemy number one status, which really mattered to these guys. They wanted to out Dillinger, and they were gunned down in the streets in Bangor, Maine. One was electrocuted in Michigan City, and they were promptly forgotten. You know, where Babyface Nelson and Machine Gun Kelly and John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde entered into the American um, mythology, these guys just never did. And I thought that was very intriguing, and I wanted to put them into it. So it's a gangster story, but it's a mother-son story at its core. We have a mother and her 12-year-old son looking for, they're kind of racing the FBI to find one of the men in this gang.
You know, I find it so fascinating that you are able to root your stories in the Midwest where you were raised and where I was raised, and a whole thing there. And then equally so, you create an access to Maine, which is like so different. And I mean, this book right now, Departure 37, does in fact do that. We have Indiana, we have Maine. And I think it's almost something that you've established as this kind of, you know, writer's access between the Midwest and Maine, particularly Indiana. I know you were brought up in Indiana. When did you start going to Maine?
The first time I was up there was actually after a private investigators conference that was in Boston. And I thought I had always I loved the idea of Maine from reading. And so I left the conference and took a few extra days and drove up the coast. And I loved this town called Camden, which is a little place sort of between Portland and Bar Harbor. And fast forward a few years, I'm at a writers' conference in Florida where I met my wife, and she was from southern Maine and had never been to Camden. And so I tried to bring her up there. I tried to be a cheap spouse and just go up the coast of Maine. We were married in Kennebunkport, and I thought, well, we'll just, go up the coast of Maine. Won't it be lovely? But she got the last laugh on that because we ended up buying a house in Camden. So it ended up being a very pricey honeymoon by the time it was all done. But it's a beautiful part of the world. Um, Very obviously picturesque. I love the way the mythology and the folklore of Maine contrasts so dramatically with the Midwest. It has an extra 200 years of history to what I grew up with, and then you go farther west, and I mean Scottsdale is like brand new compared to what I've been writing about. So I still intend to make my way out, fictional way out to the Hotel Valley Ho. There is a story there that I will write.
There is a story there, and as a matter of fact, it was built in the 1960s, and restored to the 1960s. So you can do that. The other author I know who does a sort of similar thing, or whose life is like that, but doesn't really write that way, is Douglas Preston,
Oh,
who
sure.
shares Santa Fe and Maine. He goes back and forth. But of course, New Mexico is really the oldest part of the United States. It predates the Pilgrim's arrival and all the rest of it. But he doesn't really write about it in the way that you fashion your stories along this axis. So I think it's great. You know what? We've been talking for an hour. Lord, Ian, let's see if anybody hung on long enough to want to ask a question or whether we've just blown them away.
Oh, I do have some questions here that came in for Michael. So the first one is what inspired you to write Departure 37?
I think it's as simple as the questions I had around AI, the fears I had around AI, and then that moment of realizing what a nice echo it seemed to be to the Cold War. So yeah, it was that the goal was bridging those eras.
Next question. For your research for Departure 37, was there anything that surprised you to learn or shocked you?
One of the, many things, but one that stands out is that Kurt Vonnegut had a brother, and Kurt Vonnegut believed that he was very much a sort of not the failure, but he lived in his brother's shadow. Bernard Vonnegut was this celebrated scientist who was involved with any number of projects for General Electric, including bizarrely weather modification efforts that were big in the 1950s, then were absorbed by the Department of Defense. And then after Vietnam, when we attempted to extend the monsoon season, we signed a treaty that said we would no longer play around with weather modification as a weapon of war. And that was revealed. The idea that we had done this in Vietnam was leaked in the Pentagon Papers. So it's like just a footnote in the very famous, um, information that came out from the Pentagon Papers. When I stumbled across Vonnegut's research, it was all new to me, fascinating, and I just thought I'd put it in the book, and we'll see if anybody latches on. And here we are in 2025, when anyone with a tinfoil hat on is very interested in this topic. So I didn't see that one coming.
Next question. Uh, what are your favorite and not so favorite parts of the writing process?
I really, this sounds so Pollyanna, but I really do love it all. Um, there's nothing more exciting than starting a book. The middle is always, that's the challenging part when you see the end, maybe, um, but you have to make that bridge. And I'm the guy who actually loves revising. And because I write without an outline, I know that I'm going to need many drafts. The part that I like the least is I guess it's publication when I can no longer change the book. I love it when I can still work with it.
And finally, what are you currently reading?
Oh, great question. What am I currently reading? I'm back to Barbara Kingsolver, A Second Pass Through the Poisonwood Bible, which holds up. She's an amazing writer.
Good for you. That's an excellent answer. I always feel sort of guilty asking that question because it's, everybody who's a writer and your friend flashes into your mind and you think, so, the honestly, and the answer to that most often is a dead author.
That's right. Yes.
I don't
Play
know.
it safe, right? You don't want to leave your friend out. So
That's right.
if
That's pretty
someone is
difficult. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, truly a fascinating book, but also an extremely provocative book that I think when you read it, you're going to be entertained and you're going to enjoy it, but you really need to think deeply about many of the aspects that Michael and I have talked about today. I do hope you'll write a sequel. I think there's a lot more that you can say about these characters and the kind of things. The question for you will be whether it all races ahead of you faster than you can write it.
absolutely. And that's it. It's a great point. It's one of the reasons I dialed back on the AI tech as an element of the book because I knew it would be out in front of me by the time this came along. But I loved the bigger ideas that are underneath the story. I really love those, and I think there's more to say there. So I think
It
we'll be.
really is. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how those ideas and those things progress.
And I have to answer. I have to deliver on Rob's on those blue eyes for Rob.
Yes, you
So
do. I know. I thought, wow, good for Rob. Anyway, thank you, Michael, very much.
thank
Thank
you.
you, all of you who've watched this. And as I said, we have maybe a dozen copies, signed copies left, but of course it will read the same even without a signature if we run out, or we could possibly send Michael more copies if you really care. So thanks, dear. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Night,
Thank you. You
everybody.
too. Always a pleasure.
There we go. Why is this thing in my way so I can't exit? Ah, there we go. Okay.